Hello everyone, it's Nathan here. This is a supplement to our lecture 11 on properties. So in the lecture we didn't get the time to talk through the nominalism section. So what I'd like to do in this video is talk through it. I'm going to go at a relatively slow pace, so because you can watch the video at 2x speed or something like that if you're really interested. But I want to make sure we go through each of the nominalist options, be clear on what they are, what's good about them and what's bad about them. So that's basically the plan for this supplement video. We're just going to talk about the fourth part of the lecture because we covered the other three parts actually there in person. So to begin, given the kind of difficulties facing realism about universals, one might instead opt for what we'll call nominalism. And nominalism here, the name stemming from of or pertaining to names. So the thought with nominalism is that you really only want to believe in objects. There are only particulars. We're going to deny the existence of universals as an additional category. But we still might believe in properties. But the only way we're going to believe in properties is if we identify them as a particular type of individual. Now, that's a kind of varied view of it. There are some options here. It will depend on the kind of individual you want them to be. And in fact, there's basically two forms of nominalists. The slightly, let's call them weaker form of nominalist still wants to believe in properties. So they think properties exist, but they identify properties with specific types of particulars. So just to put a label on them, we can call these reductive nominalists, because they reduce properties to some sort of particular. In contrast, the more kind of hardcore nominalists, we can call eliminative nominalists. These deny that there are properties at all. So there aren't any properties according to the eliminative nominalists. Instead, if there's anything that plays the property role, it's going to be something else. Exactly what that is going to depend on the particular view we have in mind, but that's kind of up for grabs. So, again, the nominalist, both kind of nominalists, deny that there are universals, these special entities that there can be one over many of. The reductive nominalist still believes in properties, just says they're not universals, they're different particulars. Whereas the eliminative nominalist says, you know what, I don't believe in universals and I don't believe in properties. So let's talk through forms of reductive nominalism and then we'll move on to eliminative nominalists. So the first kind of reductive nominalism we'll have is trope theory. Trope theory was popularized in kind of 50s and 60s of the 20th century. It was really developed quite nicely by B.C. Williams, extended by Keith Campbell. And the idea is that properties exist, according to the trope theorist, but they're particulars. And in particular, in particular what they are is particular property instances. So instead of thinking about redness as a universal, or something like that, instead we can talk about particular instances of red. So there'll be the fire engine's redness, the apple's redness, the sweater's redness, right? This sweater's blackness, right? The weird nebulous region just below my picture's blackness in the video. Right? All of these particular objects, these particular things, will have local, specific instances, property instances. That's, according to the trope theorist, what properties are. They're these localized instances. So we can say that X is an F if and only if there is a particular Fness, a trope, at or in X. So my sweater is black. Right? Why is my sweater black? Because there's a blackness trope that's a part of, in some sense, or in or at where my sweater is. So importantly, according to the trope theorist, we still have properties, but they're instances. So it's very close to the Aristotelian view, But instead of thinking of a property as, if you like, the thing that's multiply instanced in every particular that has the property, the trope theorist says all there is to the property are the specific occurrences. If we're going to talk about this universal, that's just loose talk. There is no such thing as a universal. There are only the local occurrences. So trope theory does remarkably well with regards to ontological economy. It posits only one category of entity, namely objects. So that's really nice. It helps quite a bit. It also seems to be able to provide something like a reference for predicates in abstract singular terms. For example, if we think about redness as an abstract singular term, we can have that refer to, say, the collection of all the tropes. Or, if you have certain views about mereology, that is, the study of parts and wholes, you might think that what redness is, in some sense, is just a weird whole built up of the parts that are each instance, each particularized locale property, like each trope. On the flip side, so maybe it can say something about reference for predicates in abstract singular terms. The difficulty for trope theory comes when we think about the one over many argument and the quantification argument. So if we remember, the one over many argument was, right, we need something that explains the resemblance between a red fire truck and a red apple, or anything like that. So the trope theorist can't appeal to something shared, because they don't believe that there's anything shared. Instead, what they have to say is that there's a resemblance between the fire engine's redness and the apple's redness. That is, these two tropes resemble each other. And so on for all of the other kind of red things. Each one will have a trope, and the reason they're all similar is because their tropes resemble each other. Now that should immediately set off some alarm bells, because we should wonder, well, cool, what is it for a trope to resemble another trope? What is it that explains the resemblance between tropes? And here, unfortunately, trope theory faces a major issue. In effect, they fall back into a problem that's very similar to what we talked about before. It looks like resemblance is either going to have to be something that can be explained by resemblance tropes. That is, the fire truck's redness has a resemblance trope, and the red apple has a resemblance trope, and it's in virtue of having those resemblance tropes that these tropes resemble each other. But of course, now we can ask, why are these resemblance tropes sufficiently resembling to each other? Oh no, we need resemblance tropes, and then we'll need resemblance tropes, and so on. So it could be a regress. Alternatively, our trope theorist could say, oh no, resemblance is just a brute primitive relation. It doesn't need explanation. The resemblance of the fire engine's redness trope and the apple's redness trope, that's rock bottom, that's primitive. The problem with this kind of response is, well, frankly, if we can do it with resemblance, why did we need any of the tropes to begin with? Why couldn't we have just said, being red is fundamental? That is, we didn't need an explanation for why the fire engine and the apple resemble each other. That could just be a brute fact too. So if we go for an unexplained primitive relation as a response to this request, this challenge, the trope theorist seems to undercut the motivation for their own position. So either they face a regress, or they put themselves in a really awkward position to motivate trope theory. Still, it's a position that's been developed quite neatly. Now, alternatively to trope theory, if we're still going with this reductive nominalism, we might be class nominalists. So probably the most famous class nominalist is David Lewis, the same person who invented modal realism. So a class nominalist thinks that properties exist, but they're not universals. Instead, properties are classes, that is, sets. And sets are, of course, just other objects. They're funny objects, admittedly. They're the ones defined in terms of the set theoretic machinery we talked about a few weeks ago. But they're still just objects. And since classes are these abstract particulars, that is, they're objects, they're sets, this is a form of nominalism. Right? Properties aren't universals. They're just particulars. But of course they exist. They're just sets. So we get then, right, X is F, an object satisfies a predicate if and only if X is a member of the class of F things. And then, of course, we can talk about the property, so something like redness, or humanity, or virtue. Right? And what are those going to be? Well, they're just going to be classes. They're going to be sets. Right? So when we talk about redness, what we really mean is it's a class of red things, right? The set of red things. And we get an easy and straightforward answer about similarity. Right? So the fire engine and the apple are similar in their redness because they're both members of the class of red things. So effectively, being a member of these classes, these sets, comes first, and it explains the various properties that things have. So this is a really lovely and straightforward view. It's extremely ontologically economic because we don't have to posit two categories of entity. We only need objects, not objects and universals. It's also an elegant account of what it is to have or to not have a property. You just go look, are you in the set or are you not in the set? If you are, you've got the property. If you're not, you don't. And it gives us straightforward solutions or explanations for the various arguments that we looked at that are supposed to motivate believing in properties. What explains resemblance? Well, being in the set. So, one over many problem is done. The quantification, we have to be committed to properties. Cool, we just be committed to sets. And then finally, the reference problem. Right? So what is the referent of redness? Well, it's this set. So we have solutions or explanations to the various arguments that are supposed to motivate properties. That looks great. The big problem for class nominalism is that it delivers the wrong identity conditions for properties. The way we can kind of come at this is by thinking about the identity conditions for sets. And if we remember, two sets are identical if and only if they have all and only the same members. So remember, this was the axiom of extensionality. Now what this means is if we identify properties with classes, that is, sets, right, then any properties that happen to be coextensive will turn out to be, according to our definition, the same property. And this turns out to be kind of weird. So Quine came up with a famous example about this. So we have renates. Renates are things that have kidneys. So they have renal systems. Renates are things that have kidneys. Contrast that with chordates. Chordates are things that have hearts. They have chordal systems. Now as it happens, just as a kind of funny fluke of biology, everything that has a kidney has a heart, and everything that has a heart has a kidney. That is, these two properties, these two classes, have the same extension. Now why is that weird? Well, because they should be two different properties. Having a kidney is one thing, or having a kidney system is one thing, having a heart is another. But it turns out that they're coextensive. So, given the axiom of extensionality, they're the same set. And if they're the same set, then the class nominalist has to believe that they're the same property. And that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So the solution, the kind of way to move from this, is instead of thinking about just extensions, that is, what members actually are in the set, we think about what we'll call intensions. Intensions are where we think about not just extensions in single worlds, but extensions across all possible worlds. So what we do is we get the extension of, say, the renates in the actual world, and then the renates in world 1, and the renates in world 2, and the renates in world 3. And then the class, the set of renates, will be the things in this world, plus the things in this world, plus the things in this world, and this world, and this world. Instead of a class, it will be a class of extensions at worlds. And what this does is it gives us a way to pull apart the two properties. Because while it happens to be the case that everything with a heart has a kidney and vice versa, it seems possible for something to have a kidney and not a heart, and have a heart and not a kidney. That is, their intentional extension are different. They do not intentionally overlap. And by tracking that, we can pull them apart. Let me note something really quickly here. This is actually written incorrectly. This should be with an S, intend with an S rather than a T. I'll fix that after the fact. So we can appeal to intentional accounts of properties or sets to then pull apart these two apparently or accidentally coextensive ones and get us the distinctness between the properties we want. Now, this seems like a good solution, at least at first glance, but it might still not be enough. To see why, consider two properties that look like they're intentionally coextensive, but still seem, or at least possibly might be, different properties. For example, consider being an equiangular triangle. That is, having angles, internal angles, of all the same degree. That seems like it's one kind of property. Now another kind of property is being an equilateral triangle. That is, having three sides of all the same length. Now, we might think of these as different, we might think of these as the same. If we think they're different, then this intentional account won't be enough. Because as it happens, whenever, and necessarily whenever, a triangle is equiangular, it's also equilateral, and vice versa. So these two properties, if they are in fact two, necessarily coextend with each other. So if we think that they're in fact different properties, we'll need to say some more about how to pull them apart. So this looks like an initial or kind of residual difficulty for this class nominalism. So our initial move, initial challenge was, look, coextensive properties wrongly turn out to be identical in this view. So the response is, all right, let's go to intentional accounts. That is, we look at extensions at worlds. And this might be satisfactory as long as you don't think there might still be excuse me, intentional differences lurking here. If you might think that even in necessarily coextensive properties could be distinct. So, let's move on to our next one. So the first two that we talked about, trope theory and class nominalism, were reductive nominalists. They still think properties exist. The other brand of nominalists are eliminative, and they deny that there are properties at all. So they're going to say, you know what, I don't believe in universals, and not only do I not believe in universals, I don't believe in properties. They are unmotivated by the three arguments we gave that are supposed to get us to existence of properties. Instead, if they think there's anything that plays the property role, they're going to find something else. And exactly what that something else is will depend on the flavor of a eliminative nominalist. So let's talk about a few. The first option is really a kind of pair, but they're very similar, so we can often treat them together. So the first one is a kind of predicate or conceptual or concept nominalist. And the idea here is that, right, we're going to deny the existence of properties and obviously also deny the existence of universals. And we're going to instead say that what there is are linguistic or conceptual elements that basically play the kind of role that properties did. So the predicate nominalist says, right, look, all there is predicates, just bits of language, and that's really all that plays the property role. So an underlying thought here is something like, we shouldn't buy into too much metaphysics, we should just think about this as somehow playing around purely linguistically, or purely at the level of language. And a similar option, the conceptual nominalist, says, okay, look, there are no properties, but it's just concepts. So when we think about an object having a property, what we really mean is that we're prepared to apply a concept to an object. So we get these two biconditionals, right? The top one characterizes predicate nominalism. Right? X is an F if and only if X satisfies the predicate F. Right? And our bottom one here characterizes concept nominalism. X is F if and only if X falls under the concept of F. And then what the predicate and conceptual nominalists try to do is use either predicates or concepts to explain away the apparent motivations behind the one over many argument, the quantificational argument, and the reference argument. Now, whether they're successful or not here is an interesting challenge. But one thing to note is that both of these views, and why they're often treated together, both of these views make having properties contingent on either the existence of language or the existence of concepts. In other words, both views make it such that having properties is a mind-dependent thing. That is, it's something like the existence of minds that's a necessary condition for anything having any properties. An upshot of this is that it looks like that were there no speakers or thinkers, were there no minds, then nothing would have any properties. And this is a kind of repugnant result for lots of metaphysicians. It might be one thing to say that we wouldn't, if there were no minds, we wouldn't be around to describe the way that things are, or describe things having properties, or even us designing some kind of language to get at what properties things have. But this is a much stronger claim than that. This has to say, these two views have to say that things wouldn't have properties at all. So there were no minds at all, right? It wouldn't make sense to say that trees are trees, because being a tree is a property. And again, this is a kind of repugnant mind dependence, an ontological mind dependence that a lot of people find not so good. So this problem alone is one that pushes many people away from this kind of form of a limited nominalism. Right? Predicate and conceptual nominalism makes having a property mind-dependent, and this mind dependence doesn't seem to really track how we think about the world out there. So a second version of a limited nominalism is what's often called resemblance nominalism. And this is a view developed by Arthur Pryor and more recently by Gonzalo Rodriguez-Perea. And again, much like the previous one, resemblance nominalism says there are no properties, right? I don't believe in properties, I also don't believe in universals. Instead, what the resemblance nominalist says is the brute fundamental facts are about resemblance. Right? Things don't resemble each other because they share a property. Rather, we can talk as if they share a property because things resemble each other. That is, we start off with a bunch of resemblance facts, and these are what we're going to take as given. So we'll say something like x is f if and only if x resembles an f, or x resembles a paradigmatic f thing. So why is my mug red? My mug is red because it resembles red things, or because it resembles this paradigmatic red thing. Say, I hold up a fire engine or something like that. So it's the resemblance facts that are taken to be fundamental, and these explain why we want to talk like there are properties, or why predications are true or false. So again, the big idea here is that what accounts for things being red or black or whatever is that they resemble each other. They're collections of resemblance. Resembling is prior to or explains the sharing of properties. Now, notably, the motivation for resemblance nominalism is effectively flipping the one over many argument on its head. Remember, the one over many argument says something like, hey, right, we have these resemblance things and they cry out for explanation. Something needs to explain them. And properties are the best explanation. The resemblance nominalist says, why think they need explaining? Resemblance facts are the floor. They're the foundation. We're going to use them to explain other things. And this is a really interesting view. It's one that's taken off quite a bit in the last 30 years or so. But it also, of course, faces a number of problems. One major problem here is that it seems to run into a problem that's very similar to class nominalism. That is, it could very quickly turn out that properties that are coextensive or contingently coextensive will be wrongly labeled as the same property. So use again renates and chordates. Right? If we think about the renates, that is the things with kidneys, defined as, right, hey, this is a renate because it resembles all these other things. Okay? Well, now we hold up a chordate. This is a chordate. This has a heart because it resembles all these other things. The problem is the classes of resemblance, the things we're holding up, would be the exact same. So it looks like on this view, it would entail that these properties are the very same property, because it's the same resemblance, effectively. So the solution here is very much like class nominalism. It's to move to an intentional account of resemblance. So instead of just thinking about the objects in this world that are resembled, we think about resemblance across all possible worlds. And this is a solution to the initial problem, but it leads to a version of the same difficulty we had before. If there are any distinct, necessarily coextensive resemblances, for example, being an equiangular triangle and being an equilateral triangle, well, then this isn't going to cut it. So it might help us with our initial cases, but there still seems to be a lurking worry about wrongly identifying necessarily coextensive but distinct properties. So that's one thing. A second problem, and probably even much worse, is the idea that we have a version of this resemblance regress lurking here. So the thought here, as we talked about this before, the thought is resemblance is a relation. And what we're supposed to be doing with any kind of nominalism or generally an approach to properties is explaining when properties and relations hold. So now we need an explanation for when resemblance holds. And we can't appeal to resemblance facts to explain resemblance facts, because that's a circular explanation. That's not a good way to go. So we need to explain when resemblance relations hold. And it doesn't seem to be possible. It doesn't seem it can be reduced to resemblance, because that either leads us to a circular analysis or an infinite regress. So it can't be reduced. The other option is, well, let's take regress, the regress relation, to be a universal. And it's the only universal. But of course, as soon as we let that open, as soon as we posit a single universal, we've lost the plot. We've lost the joys of being a nominalist. Any gain we would have made on ontological economy and not believing in universals is gone. Because we still have to buy into at least one thing that isn't a particular thing, that isn't an object. So the final objection is Goodman's imperfect community problem. We will talk about this in the tutorial. But the basic idea here is that relations are cheap. Right? Resemblances are cheap. And it seems very easy for us to generate cases, communities of objects, where resemblances generate very strange, if not impossible, properties, and lead us astray with regards to thinking about what things objects have. So we'll talk a little bit about this next Friday, but it's a neat little problem. The big ones really to think about for resemblance nominalism is, again, our identity conditions problem and the resemblance regress issue. Okay. So the final form of nominalism I want to talk about is the most hardcore, if you like. And this is a form of eliminative nominalism, again, so it denies the existence of universals and similarly denies the existence of properties. And the ostrich nominalist basically buries their head in the sand with regards to property talk. It's perfectly embodied by Quine. I'll read the quote here. He says, "One may admit that there are red houses, roses, and sunsets, but deny, except as a popular and misleading manner of speaking, that they have anything in common. There is not any entity whatever, individual or otherwise, which is named by the word redness. That the houses and roses and sunsets are all of them red may be taken as ultimate and irreducible." So the idea behind the ostrich nominalist is that property talk and this talk about resemblance and things like this, that's just sort of loose talk. We don't need them. If there is anything like resemblance facts, they're fundamental. But really, what's going to be basic, what we're just going to take as given, is that the mug is red, the fire engine's red, the apple's red. These don't need explanations. And anything that we'll talk about in terms of them having in common, that's just misleading talk. Exactly as Quine says, that's a popular and misleading manner of speaking. So we will just have a very straightforward analysis. Right? XF, if and only if XF. There's no informative story to be told here whatsoever. So, the best way to really get at what an ostrich nominalist believes is to compare it to the resemblance view. The resemblance nominalist holds that resemblance facts are fundamental, right? We take resembling facts as the basic thing and then explain everything else. The ostrich nominalist, on the other hand, takes predicational facts. So we take things like X is F, X is G, right? The mug is red. Right? Take that as fundamental, as just, we don't need an explanation for it, that's the bedrock that we start with. And then we're going to use that to explain anything else we want. And even if we don't use it to explain it, we'll dismiss the need for anything like an explanation required here. So, again, the way to kind of see it is the resemblance nominalist says something like this bullet point here. Resemblance facts explain all their property-relative facts, including subject-predicate sentences. In contrast, our ostrich nominalist says, hey, subject-predicate sentences are basic and need no explanation. And then if we want to, we can explain things like resemblance facts. But really, there are no such facts. That's just a loose way of speaking. Now, I have the parenthetical here because when you're an ostrich nominalist, you don't have to take every subject-predicate sentence as basic. For example, if I say that, right, the mug is red in a mug, I don't have to take that conjunctive fact as basic. I can instead take the two conjuncts as basic. So we might think about this as true, right, atomic or simple subject-predicate sentences are basic, and they explain all the logically complex ones. Now, ostrich nominalists are ostriches because they deny the force of any of the arguments for properties. In particular, they deny the force of the 1 over many. So that argument hinges on this claim that we have to explain resemblance. And the ostrich says, no, I don't. I don't see a problem here. Similarly, when faced with the reference argument, right, there's apparent need for a reference for predicates or a reference for terms like redness, the ostrich just says, no, I don't need to find a reference here. They'll bury their head in the sand to avoid these problems. In that sense, the ostrich nominalist has an extremely economic story, right? Because they don't even have to buy into any of the weird particulars that other people do. They can get by entirely with just everyday objects, or at least that's the hope. Now, the problem with ostrich nominalism is that, well, it leaves pretty much everything in this realm utterly unexplained. And that kind of makes sense, because basically what it's doing is it's refusing to offer any explanation. It's insisting, hey, this is the kind of stuff that doesn't even need an explanation. But, okay, that's a problem. A much more interesting problem, and one that's deliciously ironic given that ostrich nominalism is a view favored by Quine, is that it's very hard for the ostrich nominalist to push back against the quantificational argument. Remember, the quantificational argument hinged on the fact that we have sentences like this, which we take to be true. And when we regiment them, right, when we put them into first-order logic, look like they necessarily quantify over something like properties. It's very hard to think of a paraphrase for this, right? Red resembles orange more than blue, that doesn't require us quantifying over things like redness, orangeness, and blueness. Right? And so it looks like if we just take this sentence to be true, we're going to have to be committed to something playing a property role. So the ostrich nominalist, to go back a slide, might be able to avoid or bury their head and avoid the 1 over many in the reference argument, but it seems very hard for them to get out from underneath the quantificational one. They're going to need to deliver a very clever paraphrase to make sense of sentences like these. Or they can deny that they're true. But that seems a little bit difficult. These seem to be the kinds of things that we want to be true. So they're in a difficult position here. Now, what we've really been doing here is, and the ostrich nominalist is a wonderful example, is debating a little bit about whether we need to simplify ontology and complicate ideology, or vice versa. The ostrich nominalist is the ultimate form of giving a simple ontology. We only believe in things like maybe everyday objects, in favor of a complicated ideology. That is, we believe in a whole bunch of primitive subject-predicate facts. Now, notably, right, that's fair. That's a perfectly good option. Of course, we're going to face difficulties. We'll have to face things like the quantificational argument and say what's going on with these kinds of sentences. But when we're thinking about how to populate our ontology, we have this kind of debate. Right? Do we want to favor fewer numbers of things or fewer types of things, right? To go back to our qualitative and quantitative parsimony debate. Or do we want to have something like a simpler ontology? That is, lots of things, but very few unexplained or primitive predicates and concepts. The ostrich nominalist says, few things, primitive, lots and lots of primitive concepts. Someone like the Aristotelian universalist, right? The Aristotelian realist about universals says, hey, let's go lots of things, and actually a slightly complicated ideology too, because we'll need at least two categories, but we get relatively good ideology because we can explain away resemblance facts and what it means to satisfy predicates and things like this. And effectively what we can really see amongst all of these positions is dancing around how to do this trade. What's the kind of economy here? Do we want to go in hard for a complicated ontology with lots of things? And note, it could be complicated in the sense of just qualitative. We have lots of types of things, but only maybe one or two of each. Or quantitative. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of one particular kind of thing, like, say, the trope theorist. Or do we want to go hard in on ideology, lots of primitive predicates, and maybe get away with a slightly lighter or more reduced ontology? So a resemblance nominalist is a good example here. Resemblance is taken to be primitive, and then all we have to postulate on our ontological side are objects, particulars. Resemblance is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and the ontology becomes a bit lighter as we go along. So this is an interesting debate here that comes back to general concepts about theory construction, both in metaphysics and science, and in fact, more generally. Posit a bunch of primitive notions, or posit more things to help you explain away the notions. So we might wonder, where do we go from here? Well, in effect, the two camps both have good things and both have bad things. Realism about universals has the advantage of trading more ontology for a simpler ideology. We have more ontological commitments, both in the quantitative and qualitative side, but we have fewer primitive or unexplained notions. We can get rid of things or reduce, explain away a bunch of predicates or concepts by appealing to the things we have that we're committed to. In contrast, nominalist, in its various forms, trades or tends to trade complex ideology for a simpler ontology. They don't need to posit at least two categories of entities, and so instead, they can say, we have fewer things, but this comes at the cost of having a bunch more primitive or unexplained notions. So there's push and pull here, and I think that's one of the really interesting and important things to take away from this debate. We've looked at a lot of different stories about what properties are and how they work, and the thing that's really striking here is that we can make these stories work. Each one of them has problems, but really where we want to go, which options we think are best, is going to depend a little bit on how we want to make this trade-off. Do we want to lean harder into the ontology or harder into the ideology? How do we balance the two together? That's something that's interesting to think about going forward. So, just to wrap up, our move for next week is going to be thinking about objects, particulars, and specifically about how it is that we can talk about them. So our focus is going to be on singular terms, names and definite descriptions, and thinking about how singular terms might denote or refer to objects. So our reading will be a neat little chapter from Bertrand Russell, and we'll talk about some questions related to this lecture on properties, as well as questions about names and objects next Friday in the tutorial. Thank you very much for listening. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you all at the next lecture. Bye.